Hi, it's Tim Hagen from Progress Coaching, and welcome to another episode of Coaching Conversations. And I wanted to make you aware of something very cool that we're doing on a subscription basis, and we'll put a link in each one of our episodes. But every Wednesday, we're going to be doing what we call an audio podcast workshop. That workshop will be roughly about 14 to maybe 20 minutes per episode, with each month having a theme from a coaching model, using feedback strategically, to coaching self-awareness, and so on. So if you could, look in the body or in the content description of each episode, and you will see a link where you can join this subscription. These are literally 4 workshops every month, teaching specific strategies to address a particular area of workplace coaching, as it relates, again, to things like awareness, motivation, teamwork, and what have you. Here's the cool thing. It's only $10 per month, and each month you will get a handout that we will follow along with. So we also give you a tool for you to take notes as we go through each episode. We hope you'll check it out.
When we go through training and we take areas such as sales or customer service training, and certainly there are millions, if not billions of dollars spent throughout the world on leadership training. And it really begs the question, how do we improve in those areas? How does someone get better at handling an angry customer in customer service? How does somebody handle price objections or competitor objections in sales? How does a leader become better at communicating and effectively building trust? There's really one answer: practice. Recently, I was in a conversation with a number of executives and business owners, and we were just having some chit chat, and some friendships were facilitated, but there were also some prior friendships at this get together. And I asked people, I said, would you mind if I went around the room and just kind of asked people a simple question? Everyone said, sure. I said, how many of you practice your leadership skills? The room went quiet. Now, this was a very informal get together, but what was so effective is I was within eyeshot of seeing how each and every person reacted. A couple people kind of rolled their eyes like, well, not me. A couple people looked at me confused, like, why would we practice leadership? And I go back to what we do as a company. We teach coaching. We teach people how to coach negative attitudes into positive ones. We teach people how to coach millennials to show up on time and not ask for a promotion within their first 90 days of employment. We teach people how to coach people near retirement not to coast and to still give a full effort. We teach people who are at discord how to work more effectively and cooperatively together. All of those requirements that are embedded in all of our workplaces require conversation. Yet at this get together, and there was only about 12 of us, to be fair, not one person said, yes, I make a dedicated effort to practice my conversational leadership skills. I really need to practice how to converse with millennials and converse with people near retirement, converse high potential talent, and how they have to be great teammates and not run over other people. Not one person said that they had even practiced in the last year. Now, these are good people, great people, but I planted a seed. And then somebody asked me, they said, well, what should we be practicing? I said, well, let me ask you something. I said, somebody comes into your office and they say, you know what? I'm really frustrated with a couple of my teammates. One in particular who just isn't pulling his weight. And I went on and described the situation of basically an employee complaining about another employee. And I looked at him and I said, so what would you do in that moment? What would you say? He said, well, I would investigate it and I would look into it. And I smiled. I said, what would you say? He said, what do you mean, what would I say? I said, if I came in and I said, so-and-so is not pulling his weight, I'm frustrated, you have to do something. Well, I would tell them I would look into it. And I smiled again. He said, what are you smiling at, Tim? I said, it's interesting. So every time somebody comes into your office and complains about another employee, you're going to go investigate. And you're going to tell that employee right on the spot, I'll look into it. He said, what would you do? I said, I'd immediately look at that person and say, how did you approach the person? What was their reaction? Oh, I didn't approach that person. I said, why didn't you approach that person? Well, I didn't want to come off as the heavy and, kind of come off bullying them. I just said I'd come to you. Well, hypothetically, if I were to tell you that I sense you want me to own what you're choosing not to own, would that be a fair statement? And if so, what do you think we need to do to properly prepare you to have a really thoughtful and professional interaction? This gentleman looked at me and goes, that was awesome. And I said, well, I practiced. That's my point. I said, think about that subtlety. You'd have a revolving door. He looked at me and he said, you know what? I've made this mistake. I said, so have I. I'm not here to judge anybody. But I really find it funny that we spend all this money on training, yet we don't practice conversational leadership skills. But yet that particular moment, and again, I kind of tripped you up a little bit, potentially could have undermined the trust of the group. Because the minute you investigate, what are you going to say? Oh, I heard from so-and-so, or I heard from some people. He said, yeah. And I said, guess what that person's thinking? Who said it? I said, yep. Guess what just happened to the brand of your leadership? He said, just got flushed down the toilet. I said, yep. I said, don't we all make that mistake? So for the next hour, we got into this great conversation about all the things we struggle with. And what would you say and what would you do? And finally, a buddy next to me elbowed me and he said, I think you got what you wanted. I said, oh, I didn't want to turn this into a session. I said, I really am just amazed that when I go up to people and say, what did you do and what did you say in that moment? Very few, if any, people can ever answer. It doesn't mean I'm smarter. I'm certainly not. Yet we know in particular situations, we can do what? We can undermine our leadership if we're not well practiced or well rehearsed. It's kind of like an actor on Broadway. Would we really tell them not to go to the dress rehearsal? Of course not. So somebody else in the group said, well, I'll ask you something. We have a lot of millennials that are going to become our future leaders. And we have some people who are within 3 to 5 years of retirement. How do we have that conversation to get their buy-in to that transition of change? I said, ask them. He said, well, what does that sound like? I said, great, let's role play. And I went right into the role play. I said, well, Bob, and I'm going to said this to my friend Bob. I said, Bob, you're going to pretend you're near retirement. He said, great. I said, well, Bob, I think you know that we're going through a major change in the future leadership. We've certainly got to groom. And I'm wondering, as a leader today, what would be some advice you would give me to help the organization prepare? Bob, my friend, immediately breaks out a role play. He goes, well, I wouldn't approach it that way. I said, my mistake. How would you approach it? He said, well, what I would try to do. I said, no, let's role play. And he smiled at me. He said, well, I'm not comfortable. And I said, yeah. He goes, that's your point. I said, look, these are not absolute rules. These practice sessions and the way I demonstrate them are not absolute. They are not written in gold. They are not foolproof. They work every time. We're dealing with people. Yet you just broke out a role play. And when I asked you to practice it with me, he said, yeah, I wasn't ready. And I said, right. Wouldn't it be more effective if we were ready? He said, absolutely. So when we're practicing, we get better. So we went back to the role play and I said, well, Bob, let me play it all the way through. He said, sure. I said, well, what advice would you give me? He said, well, I think you really need to teach them some of the core values of the company and some of the leadership skills. And I said, well, awesome, Bob. How have you applied those? And what are you thinking are some of the more valuable principles that our corporation has instilled that you think a young leader would really benefit from? Bob went on and expounded upon it. And I said, well, how would you, if you were to give me a step-by-step approach of how to facilitate that improvement, what would you encourage me to do? He went on and gave very descriptive steps. And I said, what would your involvement look like? And Bob smiled. He said, wow. He said, you're having a conversation. You're not trying to tell me to have buy-in. You're not saying I need to help. You're facilitating it through conversation. I said, exactly. Now, as you listen to this podcast, you might think, boy, is this guy arrogant. I'll be the first one to tell you, I've made all the mistakes of every manager and leader. What I will tell you is I'm willing to practice it. I'm willing to practice different dialogues, different conversation pieces, using different language, using different questions to maximize people's self-awareness so they can pursue improvement. That's why we coach. Yet, we know if we're not well prepared, it can chip away at the brand of our leadership, our personal brand of leadership. So I'm going to ask you a question. Are you ready?
Thank you for listening to another episode of Coaching Conversations by Tim Hagan and Progress Coaching. Now, our company is always coming out with new and innovative solutions to help leaders coach their employees. And recently, we just created a new service called Coach to You, where leaders can pick and choose topics and assign 7 to 21-day programs for employees to learn and, more importantly, apply actions and then reflect and share what they're going to do going forward as a result of the learning. It's called Coach to You. We're literally bringing coaching to your employees. If you're intrigued, we'll have a link in each one of our episodes where you can get more information. And again, thank you so much for listening to another episode.